on collaboration and activism. My name is Alexia Arani. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am a PhD candidate in anthropology and critical gender studies at the University of California, San Diego. I am a mixed race woman of color with light brown skin, long wavy black hair, and I am wearing a blue and green button-up shirt and some light purple lipstick. Our first presentation today is going to be Erin L. Durbin. They are an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, and they will be giving a talk entitled Patchwork Ethnography and Disability Justice.
Hi everyone, I'm Erin, and I am a white person with Harry Potter glasses and queer hair and a black shirt, button-up shirt, and I am in a blurry Zoom universe for this presentation. I just want to start by thanking the organizers for inclusion on the program, and I'm really honored to be here. It's been really meaningful for me to hear other people's presentations, and I like that bit yesterday about not feeling so alone, and that is definitely the feeling I have being here with all of you. So for my presentation, I started with the question, how do we create models for ethnography from the recognition that disabled researchers and a greater diversity of body minds are beneficial and necessary to decolonial and feminist anthropological knowledge production? I'll also say I'm having a really hard time breathing. So that is, if I might need to stop in the middle of the presentation. So I arrived at this question as a disabled activist scholar who's been contending with and writing about ableism in anthropology and who wants to move beyond critique towards new possibilities. So I designed an ethnographic project that was collective, undertaken with my family members, neighbors, and students, accessible from home and on crypt time, and intentionally mixed ability. In the short presentation, I'll provide an overview of these aspects of the project and its compatibilities with patchwork ethnography as an emergent methodological and theoretical conceptualization of ethnographic research. My presentation today is informed by two coinciding life events. 4 years ago, I moved full-time into an anthropology department, having interdisciplinary degrees and commitments, while also beginning to contend in a significant way with debilitating chronic illnesses. I was unsure whether I had the capacity to continue as an assistant professor of anthropology, given the constraints of academic ableism, as well as the new absence of the capacities that had enabled my previous patchwork ethnographic fieldwork in Haiti over nearly a decade, when I had been working primarily around financial, familial, and other health constraints. Rather than leaving the academy, I've been seeking out different ways to inhabit tenure-track life, learning tips and tricks for more sustainable and slower work around predictable and unpredictable health issues, and patching together new methods along the way. I wrote about this predicament in a forthcoming article in American Anthropologist titled Ableism in Anthropology. In it, I counter the usual concern about chronically ill and disabled anthropologists, which is how to accommodate them in an ableist discipline, by instead focusing on the underlying ableist mandates of fieldwork. I make a series of related claims to support the argument that ableism is inherent to anthropology's disciplinary formations. First, that the normate anthropologist has always had a non-disabled body mind. As other presenters have already mentioned, the prototypical anthropologist has been a lone and unencumbered white man who uses his hypermobilities to navigate informants' immobilities. Second, that the continuation of fieldwork practices from the colonial model of anthropology naturalizes able body minds, and without intervention will continue to reproduce an ableist anthropology. Third, that the turn towards multi-sited fieldwork and therefore increased mobility has compounded the ableist pressures normative to the discipline. And finally, that once disability became a proper and distinguishable object for anthropology, a line was solidified between anthropologists and the disabled, thereby making disabled anthropologists a seemingly conceptual impossibility. Given these structures, as well as active discrimination against disabled scholars, it's no wonder that there are so few disabled anthropologists. So there seem to be a lot in the Patchwork Ethnography webinar, which I really love, and I think is telling. Certainly, I have a personal stake in changing how we think about the place of disabled and chronically ill people in anthropology, but the implications of doing so are much broader when the majority of people with chronic illnesses, disabilities, or who are otherwise debilitated are poor and working class, BIPOC, queer and trans, and from the global South. I believe that illuminating the normative underpinnings of anthropology and embracing the unbearable possibility that we all might be or become disabled can get us to collectively consider what anthropology might be otherwise. My most significant experiment reaching towards this otherwise is an ongoing project about the University Grove faculty neighborhood at the University of Minnesota on the St. Paul campus. I live in University Grove with my spouse, Miranda, who's also a faculty member in gender, women, and sexuality studies, and my primary collaborator on the project. And Miranda is attending today, but she might want to participate in the Q&A session. The University Grove project was a solution I conceived of to offer required research experience in my ethnographic research methods course during the pandemic. The methods that I highlight here were informed by my work in cross-disability community, disability anthropology, critical disability studies, and specifically the principles of disability justice, including intersectionality, sustainability, recognizing wholeness, collective access, and interdependence. This project enabled the continuation of students' fieldwork training in a way that I hope to draw attention to disability in the field and begin to interrupt ableist ideas about the right way to do anthropology. It also provided a collective opportunity for students after the murder of George Floyd in the Twin Cities to reckon with institutional racism in a contemporary moment of the Black Lives Matter movement and settler colonialism as students attending a land-grant university in the United States. Enabling students to participate in ethnographic research from their various locations in the vein of distance ethnography, remote ethnography, fieldwork from afar, and anthropology from home was the primary accessibility consideration. However, the research design necessarily reflected our access needs, and that being Miranda's needs, my needs, which include hearing loss, arthritis, other embodied physical immobilities, immunocompromised body minds in a pandemic, and the significant increase in caretaking and reproductive labor. Thus, we stayed in bed, at home, and close to home, and access technology facilitated our collaboration. The student collaborators have accompanied us and our neighbors through our daily lives in University Grove and to the University Archives reading room with the assistance of the internet, an action camera, a digital audio recorder, virtual maps, video chat, and video hosting platforms with captions. The collective approach is essential to our ethnographic research redesign. Following the disability justice model of mixed ability organizing with a lead, which is me, and an anchor, which is Miranda, our partnership makes the work possible and sustainable, even when one person is unavailable in a given moment for something as short as cooking a meal or as long as a few week pain flare-up. Our now 8-year-old kid and our 18-year-old nibbling eagerly assisted with research activities by distributing flyers at all 103 houses in University Grove to increase survey participation, by recording audioscapes of the neighborhood, photographing lawn ornaments and yard signs, organizing digitized files from the university archives, reflecting on what it's like to visit or live in University Grove, and much more. We also have had more than a dozen students as collaborators with whom we share the responsibility, appropriately to a limited extent and with guidance, for data collection and analysis. For instance, they collected data from Zillow, Google Maps, the University Real Estate Office, participation in digital and in-person neighborhood events, which were recorded for remote participants, and semi-structured interviews with over 24 residents. An additional benefit of these collaborations is that it provides multiple opportunities for researchers to develop a greater awareness of their or our own positionality. Everyone has had to account for what they miss, notice, or understand in the field and the conclusions that they or we draw in relationship to collaborators. This process was facilitated by everyone having access to mostly the same data, each other's field notes, and then gradually shifting to collective field notes in Google Docs. Having collective field notes was additionally helpful for people to track the project who were unable to engage in research activities because of illness, caretaking, overwork, or anything else. And when one of our student collaborators suddenly had to transition to using voice-to-text software after an accident, it smoothed notoriously difficult management of this technology in at least one area of her academic life. Also, in the spirit of collective access, the project enabled mixed ability research taking into account different bodily capacities. For example, as often as possible, sense-organized fieldwork experiences. Collaborators with site capacity collaborated on creating field notes from video footage from the action camera that essentially provides a transcript for those who are blind or visually impaired to participate in collective analyses of the data. Likewise, those with hearing capacity collaboratively created field notes of audio files accessible to those who are deaf or hard of hearing. Because of the primacy of the visual in ethnographic research, the student collaborators found this audio engagement disorienting because they wanted to match the bird song to the bird, the passing vehicle noise to a car or van, voices to faces, etc. The students came up with ideas to get a sense of other embodied experiences of University Grove, such as asking residents what they thought it smelled, tasted, or felt like to live here. They questioned whether it would be helpful to share specific items like plants from the neighborhood to touch and smell, whether it wasn't because they would be taken out of context, or whether, like David Valentine's ethnography from afar with people who go into outer space where he will never go, that sensing these items provided another partial embodied way to understand the context. Clearly, since accessibility is an ongoing process rather than an achievement, we altered the methods that I've been highlighting to respond to the unanticipated and shifting needs of ourselves and our collaborators, as well as their input about what would positively contribute to the project. Overall, the University Grove project has opened up new spaces for intimacy within our family, with our neighbors, and with student collaborators. These connections have been enriching for all the collaborators' lives and have been sustaining us through multiple crises: COVID-19, emergency surgeries, family businesses damaged by white supremacists, mental health breaks, brief periods of incarceration, unexpected moves, the loss of reproductive support for ourselves, our children, and parents, intensifications of racialized violence, the Chauvin trial, and much more. In being guided by the principles of disability justice, the University Grove project aligns with patchwork ethnography that likewise articulates investments in care, collective access, and creative ways of continuing the work that is meaningful and necessary to our lives. What I hope to bring to our conversations is more of an emphasis on collaborative research, within already existing partnerships with our intergenerational families, biological and chosen, and beyond. When the Manifesto for Patchwork Ethnography was published, it offered a way of conceptualizing the work that we were already doing, or as the authors write, consolidating the interventions that are already happening in anthropology out of necessity in a way that made me hopeful for a future anthropology that promotes greater accessibility for researchers as part of a broader vision for intersectional social justice in our discipline, the academy, and the places where we live and work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin, for that talk and giving us some really clear examples of what it might look like to put access at the center of our research. So next, we have Sucharita Kanji-Lal, a PhD candidate in anthropology at the University of California, Los Angeles. And they will be reading their talk, COLA, COVID-19 and the Limits of Ethnographic Production Amid Graduate Precarity.
Hi everyone, so I'm Sucharita. I'm a PhD candidate at UCLA. I am a South Asian woman. I'm wearing glasses, kind of Harry Potter like everyone else. And I have brown wavy hair. Yeah, so I'm gonna share my screen, just a few slides, but it's mostly spoken presentation. Okay. So at the far end of the anthropology teaching assistant's office, two graduate workers stood on opposite windowsills, holding up a 12-foot banner that read in enormous letters, "Pay us enough to live here." 6 others had climbed onto chairs or were sitting on filing cabinets, some passing tape, others directing the installation, and one posting a flyer for next Tuesday's organizing meeting to the UCLA for COLA Instagram page. These graduate workers, all members of the UAW 2865 Union Local, were rallying their campus in solidarity with their graduate colleagues at UC Santa Cruz, who had earlier that week started an unprecedented wildcat grading strike. Wildcat, in that the strike was organized by the union's rank and file outside of the official strike period allowed during contract bargaining, and a grading strike in that hundreds of UCSC grads were withholding fall quarter grades in lieu of a cost of living adjustment, a COLA. Graduate organizers at Santa Cruz, one of California's most expensive cities to rent in, found immediate support across the University of California campuses, all located in similarly unaffordable cities. 4 other UCs quickly followed suit with their own escalating labor actions in the early months of winter 2020, with the remaining campuses getting ready to strike when the COVID-19 pandemic shut the UCs down and knocked the wind out of COLA's sails. At UCLA and elsewhere in the US, anthropology graduate workers have been at the forefront of these organizing efforts. On some campuses, the anthropology presence was so strong that opponents of the strike sent out dire warnings on online message boards that read, "Stay away from these strike actions. They are dangerous and being led by a bunch of anthro-ultras." Ultras, as my students would later inform me, stood in this case for ultra-radicals. For those of us who have grappled with the discipline's history, the accusation that anthropologists are inherently ultra-radical has a certain irony to it. Anthropology's liberal suppositions have for the past few decades been so thoroughly called out from within the discipline that leading faculty recently recommended that we let anthro burn. How do we square the damning critique of anthropology's inherent liberalism with a season of labor organizing by ultra-radical graduate anthropologists organizing strikes that spread like wildfire to campuses across the country? The COLA actions at the UCs might have slowed down as the pandemic gained ground, but graduate strikes across the US have only intensified ever since, with NYU, Columbia, and the University of Michigan, among others, organizing well-publicized and often overwhelmingly successful labor actions. Anthropology graduate students have had particular reason to be closely aligned with these struggles. Years of stagnating funding packages, which often include a heavy teaching load and only 5 to 6 years of guaranteed funding for a program that can take up to 8 years to finish, meant that the anthrograds at the UCs, for instance, had already been organizing before the COLA actions began. Many had petitioned individual departments, which had helplessly passed them on to graduate administrators, who in turn kicked the can right back to the departments. There was, it seemed, no money to be found for graduate teaching and research, though undergraduate enrollments in anthropology were booming, and the UCs had, conversely, plenty to spare in their budget for an ever growing UCPD. While graduate funding is scarce for most social science and humanities disciplines in the US, anthropology graduate workers face an added year or more of uncertainty because the discipline's requisite mode of research, long term and mainly in person ethnography, is predicated on material conditions for which few departments provide enough resources. Ethnography might lie at the heart of anthropology, yet it is funding for ethnography that is not guaranteed by the university or anthropology departments often, leaving graduate anthropologists to patch together funds from an ever dwindling pool of external resources. In addition to the living and research costs associated with ethnography itself, anthropology grads in the US, who often make less than $20,000 a year, must pay extra to move to their sites, often fly internationally once a year, find subletters for cramped apartments or risk going into further debt, and eventually pay to move back. This financial crisis has been deepened by the COVID-19 pandemic, as graduate students have received few time to degree or funding extensions, and fieldwork grants have often been rescinded. Even as fees continue to be paid, tenure clocks are paused, and university administrators are still drawing disproportionate salaries. For international graduate workers, anthropology's working conditions are worse in the US, with shorter degree timelines and visa restrictions that disqualify them from working off campus. Graduate anthropologists spend more time applying for small grants, any amount helps, inventing side hustles, and looking for summer funding and cheap housing than they do on actual ethnography. Far from luxuriating over ethnographic questions on faraway islands for years on end, ethnography for graduate anthropologists is always already patchwork. The call for abandoning anthropology's liberal suppositions, then, cannot remain merely a conceptual question about anthropology's future. It must include a reckoning with the material conditions that shape anthropologists' ability to produce these knowledges in the first place. Much of these conditions stem from the larger context of the neoliberal university, the groundwork for which might well have been laid at the University of California itself in the 1970s. Ronald Reagan, then the governor of California, suggested that the formerly free public universities, which at the time catered largely to white US-born men, start charging tuition in order to get rid of undesirables in the wake of student agitations for ethnic studies departments and against McCarthyism and the Vietnam War. Similarly, it is not a coincidence that as anthropology departments started recruiting more women and scholars of color who would take on more critical ethnographic projects, funding for anthropology departments and ethnographic research has dwindled. The latest iteration of this funding squeeze has, for instance, resulted in American anthropology departments refusing to recruit international graduate students altogether because of their high non-resident tuition costs. To what radical political horizon can American anthropology aspire if all of its ethnographic research is conducted only by American citizens? If contemporary American anthropology is to organize against these material conditions, it must confront two intertwined questions. Are graduate students workers? And is ethnography labor? While the University of California was home to the earliest iterations of the neoliberal university, it was also an early site of labor struggle for graduate students. Our union local UAW 2865 was formed after decades of organizing by teaching assistants and research assistants seeking to have their role as workers recognized through the right to collective bargaining and unionization. Other US universities have since recognized graduate labor unions, if begrudgingly so. Yet, the question of whether graduate students are workers is far from settled. As recently as March 2021, the National Labor Relations Board was contemplating a rule that denies TAs and research assistants at private universities the right to unionize on the grounds that they were students, not employees. Though this Trump-era proposal has since been rescinded, university administrators routinely deploy this logic of the Schrodinger's graduate student, treating us alternately as workers when exploitable teaching and research labor is required to run the university, and students when the time comes to pay us for that work. Far from being in opposition to this framing, anthropology as a discipline has long profited of the convenient slippage between the sometimes student, sometimes worker, graduate researcher. Graduate researchers carry out a bulk of ongoing ethnographic research, both for their own dissertation projects, but also the grunt work of data collection for the better funded projects of tenured faculty mentors in return for meager research stipends or sometimes the uncompensated honor of professional experience. This exploitation is made possible by the conceptual sleight of hand that frames graduate anthropologists as initiates in Douglas Holmes and George Marcus's terms. Would-be anthropologists whose early fieldwork is merely a rite of passage ritual into the discipline of anthropology proper. Once the graduate's initiation is complete, the now seasoned ethnographer will purportedly be able to pursue their itinerant curiosities as comfortable tenured faculty. This framing of ethnography, not as labor, but as a rite of passage and the pursuit of intellectual passion, relies precisely on the image of the romanticized white male adventurer sailing away to far-flung corners of the world with nothing but the spirit of inquiry, the always available and up for anything fieldworker that Grinnell, Verma, and Watanabe so sharply call into question in their manifesto for patchwork ethnography. It is this illusion of ethnography as an initiation rite and passion project, rather than as labor, that aligns anthropology with the neoliberal labor conditions more broadly, justifying the exploitation of graduate workers and contingent faculty as initiates or unpaid interns, supposedly earning experience for future academic jobs that do not actually exist. It is this framing that leaves graduate anthropologists as part-time gig workers in the university who must simultaneously monetize their side hustles and hobbies in order to get by. The COLA struggle for graduate students in anthropology, many of whom were international students, was a response to a culmination of these adverse labor conditions. The demand for a living wage was a call for anthropology to abandon its liberal suppositions in material terms. It demanded a reckoning with the masculinist, race, class, and ableist assumptions about the kinds of work and the kinds of workers who should be allowed into this discipline as it struggles and organizes to move away from its colonial past and redefine its emerging political horizons. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very important talk. As a grad student in the UC system, it resonates, and I'm very glad we were able to include it. So we have one more presentation for this panel. We have Ana Cristina Pertierra, who will be presenting on behalf of her research team. She is an associate professor at the Institute for Culture and Society at Western Sydney University, and the paper is titled Collaborative Research Across the Global South, Studying New Consumer Cultures. Welcome, Ana.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I'm Ana. I have white skin, long dark hair, glasses, and I'm wearing a dark green jumper that was knitted for me by my mother. I'm here in Sydney, Australia, and I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the land of the Wangal people of the Eora Nation, who've been the custodians of this land for millennia and whose sovereignty was never ceded. I pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and I would like to extend that respect to any other Indigenous people of Australia or other places who may be sharing this event with us today. It's my great pleasure to present some ideas and experiences that have emerged from this project, which we officially began in 2019. Although, as with many projects, the roots of it and the grant which funds it had quite a long prehistory. Our project is called No Longer Poor, Not Yet Middle Class, New Consumer Cultures of the Global South. And we've been undertaking our research in 4 cities, Guangzhou in China, Metro Manila in the Philippines, Mexico City in Mexico, and Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. We are 5 women, all of us collaborating on this research project from our different kinds of challenging environments and contexts. I was raised in Australia and I have Filipino heritage and have many years now working in Latin America and the Philippines. And the administrative and bureaucratic engine of our research sits with me in Sydney. All 4 of my collaborators, as well as myself, have trained and worked internationally, but each of them are overseeing research cities in this project that are taking place in their home countries. All of us speak at least 2 of the languages used in our project, but none of us speak all of them. We all have secure jobs in universities, which is important to note, and we're all anthropologists and sociologists with extensive experience in the field. We have different connections to one another. Both my father and my daughter are each entangled in networks of relationships that make our intellectual work possible and meaningful. And since this project began, our combined life experiences have included 2 transnational relocations, relationship breakdowns, family death, serious illness, and more. The COVID pandemic, of course, and consequent border closures and lockdowns have affected all of our most intimate relationships with partners, parents, friends, and colleagues living through different restrictions, and the mobility across regional and international territories that constituted our family lives has been curtailed with stressful effect. As Atsiri notes, and she's here today in the attendees, this requires rethinking and reconnecting with our hometowns, which may no longer be home, but still have strong associations, and often have been romanticised, embellished, or simplified by distance and time. Other challenges come from our different working situations, with many of these differences intensified during the pandemic. For example, Sarina reflects on the difficulties in Filipino universities of achieving a balance between teaching, research, and service when most academics teach at least 8 3-hour classes a week. And during this fieldwork for this project, Sarina had to draw upon an intrinsic motivation to research amidst many other professional responsibilities. So the vision of a researcher fully devoted to fieldwork and writing is uneven in its possibility to be achieved in many of our settings. And these matters are not mere distractions from or delays to the project, as the project is constituted by us and our relationships. Our different situations constitute the framework within which our work must take shape. So one thing to note is that the COVID-19 pandemic was only one of the challenges that we faced, and an unsurprising insight of our project is that there is never a neutral political moment in which research can take place. There is especially not a neutral, stable moment in the particular sorts of cities our project focused on, with dense populations, transnational mobilities, and turbulent political cultures, at least in 3 of the 4 places we're working, and radical urban transformation. Consider that at the beginning of our project, recent elections of Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, Andrés Manuel López Obrador in Mexico, and Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil were each understood, although in different contexts, as expressions of class dynamics in which populist leaders were seen to offer solutions to a status quo of dynamic but difficult liberal democracies. The kinds of political events that happen in these places directly impact the communities that we're working with, but particularly in Brazil, they also saw the election of a government actively hostile to academic research. So Rosana migrated from Brazil to the United Kingdom in November 2019 due to a combination of economic and political factors. While investment in higher education fell, Rosana, who also studies authoritarianism in the Global South, was increasingly experiencing political attacks and persecution from Bolsonaro supporters and Brazilian institutions. More recently, changing geopolitics of China's relationship with other countries in the Asia Pacific, including Australia, adds some possible complications to planning our project's continued collaborative dimensions, although I cannot say that we've experienced any real consequences of this to date. So it is both the appeal and the challenge of our research that all of the 4 cities in which we've worked, while characterised by differences, are turbulent and fast changing in the global economy of the early 21st century. And these are exactly the kinds of cities in which the COVID-19 pandemic has had such massive impact. So the virus's global trajectory spread across our field sites in a neat chronological pattern. First, Guangzhou was shut down at the beginning of 2020. Then the pandemic spread rapidly to Manila by February, before reaching Mexico and Brazil from March 2020 onwards. Sustained shutdowns in Guangzhou and Metro Manila, the latter city having the dubious distinction of the world's longest lockdown to date, halted some final steps in our field research in those cities, although our main interviews had already taken place. But our plans for the Americas, which were supposed to take place in mid-2020, were held off until this year. So now we have completed most of our work in Mexico, but are just beginning to work in our final city of Rio. Inevitably, our project has taken on a sort of before and after bifurcation, as the Asian cities captured portraits of everyday life very shortly before things changed quite radically. In Mexico and soon in Brazil, the interview experience is inevitably a joint reflection with participants on how their consumption has changed due to the pandemic and its economic effects. While some forms of consumption have receded, such as time spent in shopping malls or eating at restaurants, others have increased, such as payments for internet access and an intensification of home cleaning products. The mobile phone has attained a new status as an irreplaceable item during lockdown. And the methods of our research have inevitably also changed, as our local research teams, while living in the same country as the research participants, have undertaken interviews using Zoom. And if I had more time, I would mention some of the new possibilities that this enforced methodological shift have offered us. But I might leave that to the Q&A session if we have time for broader discussion about the things that we've discovered in our methodological shift halfway through. I gave a presentation of work on this project in November of 2020, and our discussant, my colleague at Western Sydney University, Dr. Malini Suhr, observed that we seem to be doing patchwork ethnography. And I thank her very much for this observation, which led us to this webinar. The patchwork nature of our approach is evident in a number of ways. First, the patches we've each started on are all at different points in the blanket. In China, in the Philippines, and now in the Americas. Each city has a research team which is working to a centrally agreed set of themes and develops approaches and practices that have been shared and adapted between each city as we go. But the focus and interests of each city and time have been slightly different. And with each new group, we've worked with each other and with our research assistants to insist that this lack of exact correlation is perfectly okay. In this way, each piece of patchwork assumes a similar shape, but has different colours or designs. We are not attempting to make each patch identical, but the idea is to make work in each place that from the beginning has been intended to be carried out and analysed alongside the other places and times. And as with a patchwork quilt, it is in the stitching up that we can make the whole blanket beautiful. The patchwork is also in the stories of our participants. These are glimpses into lives at particular moments. They're not a systematic attempt to represent a whole community. And in our project, in order to widen the geographic scale, we've limited the depth to which we spend time with each of our participants. Many of them are interviewed for between 1 or 2 hours, while some of them have been recruited through our personal networks and therefore have longer connections to our lives, there are many others whose relationship to the researchers and the project has only been as fleeting as the interview. So to date, I have not claimed that the work we are doing is ethnographic in the most rigorous or traditional sense. And as our project is very multidisciplinary, we've not been beholden to an expectation that ethnography is required. Yet the comments that Malini made when she suggested that we were doing patchwork ethnography highlight how our ethnographic training and our deeper cultural expertise enables us, the researchers, to do the stitching together that makes our work meaningful. An ethnographic sensibility does not only come from the duration of presence in a field, nor only from the duration of relationship between research participant and researcher, although both of these can be productive intensifiers of an ethnographer's understanding. While our engagement with specific participants in our project has not been especially deep, our understanding of the communities and contexts from which they come has certainly been a key part of our project's viability. The success with which our different patches may be brought into the patchwork depends in part upon how nicely we can understand the broader fabric from which we have cut our patch. There's also something about the patchwork nature of our approach to this project's comparative design, of the crookedness of different pieces of work and the openness to finding new pieces to cut and add to the puzzle, that echoes the more creative and improvisational elements of ethnography that I personally find compelling and rewarding. And in the unstable context that our project has been launched into, this improvisational element has frankly been the only possible way to proceed. So speaking for myself, although my collaborators have agreed when contributing to this paper, it's one of the great privileges of my increasing career stability to feel able to freely say, The work has to work for our lives, and I only want to share doing my work with people I want in my life. And may I say that this project has confirmed that I care more about the process and experience of working with others and working with other women, which crucially includes both the creation of work opportunities for others and the invitation for others to shape my work. I care more about that process and experience than I do about the supposed outcome of the work as an intellectual product. And here too, I recall the point of patchwork and craft work more generally, as not only consisting of the finished project or the finished product, but of being an important social practice in itself, which brings crafters together to share skills and ideas and pass the time, to take pleasure in the construction and comparison of work, and to embed parts of their vision and history into pieces of material culture. There is much honour in crafting work well as much pleasure, and events like this one show why and how this is so. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anna, for that talk. We're now going to bring back all of our panelists. We have about 25 minutes for Q&A. So as a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, you can type that into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So I'm going to get us started with the first question that I think really any of the panelists could answer. So, is ethnography labor? That's a question that Sucharita asked. And I think this panel today, as well as the conversations we had yesterday, show that yes, ethnography is a form of labor. And it often involves unseen emotional labor, as well as care work. So care and mutual aid came up in the discussions of collaboration, as well as solidarity with fellow striking graduate students. I'm wondering how each of you understand care and collaboration as central to our relationships with our interlocutors and not just with each other as researchers. So whoever would like to take that one, feel free.
I can go first. So in terms of the question of ethnography as label, I think the slippage between ethnography as a hobby, ethnography as just something you do while you're living your life, which is an important question as well because you are often living your life as you're doing ethnography. I guess the call to think of it as label in some ways is a way of trying to say that it should be paid for. And I know that that's a complicated thing. But in terms of thinking of it as something that you do get paid a living wage for, it's shocking how rarely that happens. People end up doing ethnography by couch surfing, by living with relatives, as if that's not, part of the research expense. In terms of care and collaboration, I think that I use the word organizing often in my talk, and the call was to get I guess graduate students who have been organizing, contingent faculty who have been organizing on their own, but to get other members of the anthropology community, including say tenured faculty members, to be organized and collaborate with us as workers, seeing ourselves, all of us, as workers in anthropology, and in that sense present an opposition to the neoliberal university collaboratively as an organized front. So I think in terms of thinking of it as labor, the call to think of it as labor is a call to bring people into this consciousness as workers together. Yeah.
You, anyone like to respond or build on that?
I can't quite tell if we're all on the panel together, because yesterday it seemed like there was sort of blocks of people, and now I can't actually see the ASL interpreter. So I'm not sure. I think that is the ASL interpreter on the screen?
Thank you for checking, Erin. Let me look at our logistic text real quick. Let's see, maybe if our attendees could let us know. Looks like yes, they're able to see the interpreter.
Okay, that's great. So it's something peculiar to the panel. But I'll say a little bit about that in terms of my project. I have always thought that those aspects or components of projects are important, and not just when I'm talking about a collaborative project now, but that part of working in different communities is really being there and being present with people, however you need, cooking meals together, taking care of people's kids, letting people do things for you as a researcher, to not just, having them be sort of full relationships. And, so for the University Grove project, that meant sometimes, like, when I'm asking my neighbors whether they'll be willing to, to be interviewed for the project, and go, well, I know you have 4 kids. Is there a way, like, would I be able to watch your kids while you're doing the interview? Or are there ways to sort of bring even our analyses in a way with care? That has felt important to me, not only when I'm studying sort of US imperialism in Haiti, but here where I'm in relationship with people, and it's a lot of different kinds of relationships. There are people in my neighborhood I really like and ones I don't like very much, but that I bring the full insights of my own and of other people to those relationships, which I think can be very daunting, but is a form of care, to not just hold critique to the side, but to bring it into those relationships. So that is one of the ways I would answer that question.
Thank you. We have another question here. This was addressed to you, Aaron, but I think all of the collaborators could speak on this. It's from Sumi. It's, are there ways in which you have rethought this collaborative ethnographic project after having done it once? Are there any aspects you would change and or would definitely want to replicate? So Anna, I don't know if maybe you would like to speak to that. I know you have many collaborators and I imagine things can get messy at times.
Well, I was thinking as Rosa and others were speaking about what the challenges are around collaboration with many people, and I think perhaps what we haven't talked about so much, and because it's not very exciting as well, are all of the challenges that come around things like logistics or kind of bureaucratic processes. And that's also when you have a collaboration between more and more people, it's not just there's a political and hierarchical issues, but there are also plain old administrative and logistical issues and paperwork issues and employment contract issues or expenses issues. And whether a grant is small or large, I think it's not so much about the size or the seniority of the team, but when projects get more and more people, there are more and more processes to be managed in different kinds of institutional settings. And so most of the things that I would do differently are around that. But yes, in terms of the challenges that do happen, I mean, I don't know how much detail I should go into really, because not all of us are here, some of us are here, but there's definitely been some political challenges that have curtailed our work, and also illness challenges that have curtailed our work. And I cannot say that it has been a problem for us really, but maybe somebody evaluating the so-called successes of our grants in a very mechanistic or quantitative way might disagree. So I think prioritizing the relationships makes it work, but perhaps that is to overlook the challenges that we may have when we get to the point that Rosa said they're not at either, when we're accounting for our productivity. Yeah.
I was actually thinking in terms of care. Saiba might really be like a good person to answer this, but like, care is not always helpful. And I think, in the way that I'm trying to articulate care, and I think the way we're moving towards is the kinds of relationship building and sort of like extra attention towards social justice, like supporting people when they are when we are subject to structural oppression, and like really keeping that at the forefront of mind, that care in this meaning is meant to counter the work maybe of like institutional care or military care or missionary kinds of care, and it's really thinking about how people have had resources extracted or sort of deprived, that people have been deprived of the things that they've needed, and like how to be conscientious about approaching that. And I actually put in the Q&A a book called Care Work Dreaming Disability Justice, as somebody had just said, like, what are some references around like cross disability organizing or multi-ability research. And I think that that book, the sort of experiments people have done with care webs in the Bay Area, Toronto, we're trying them here, like that have that sort of in mind. And we don't do that kind of work often in the academy for each other. And I didn't say this explicitly, I moved out of gender, women's sexuality studies into anthropology. And one of my colleagues, my first year, had to have a surgery. And I said, well, can't we share our sick days and sort of pool them, like in addition to like covering courses and stuff? And they were like, why, what? Can we even do that? Like just thinking radically, I don't even know if that's radical, about resource redistribution. And there's already been stuff about mutual aid on here, but that really being the forefront of the kind of care work we do.
Thank you. And I'm always happy when care work gets name dropped because it's an incredible book. So Sucharita, I'm not sure if you saw, but the chat was going off during your talk. There was a lot of resonances. And some of the questions that were coming up were basically, well, where do we go from here? How can grad students, precarious workers, continue to advocate in their departments, in campus, or in anthropology at large? And then a second part of that question is, do you have hope for the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'll answer the second part first. I have some measured hope for the future, only because of all of the recent strike efforts and unionization that's happening not only in academia but outside of academia. And it seems like, at least in the US and in certain other parts of the world, a good time for labor organizing. I think the important thing and to answer the first part of the question, is to not see these in isolation. So whether that's the Amazon Union or the New Yorker Union or the grad union at NYU or Harvard, at bigger schools, at smaller schools, they've had varying levels of success by trying to bridge sort of the ideas that they have together. This is not to say that graduate students are the same as Amazon workers. They're not. And very often, someone like graduate workers are already coming more or less or mostly from positions of privilege. That's why you would make the choice to get into graduate school at all. But the point of organizing together, supporting efforts that are on campus, and that may or may not be through a union, it may be through mutual aid groups, it may be through abolitionist organizing, excuse me for the sound. I think the reason to do it, to encourage it, and across different kinds of class groups and worker groups, is is exactly that, to allow people to make an anthropology or a university where you don't have to be rich to do it in the first place, to make it a place where someone could come in expecting fair wages and fair working conditions without having to have a trust fund or a rich grandparent who's funding your fieldwork. Where someone who is an Amazon worker can also be a grad student, and to not kind of continue to maintain the class division. So I think the way to keep advocating is to keep advocating, and to not, it's exhausting. I can tell you from just some of our work in the university, we've been told all kinds of things like wait for the Olympics to come to LA and then we'll build a lot more housing for the athletes and that'll eventually become housing for graduate workers. You hear the most absurd things when you ask for things, but you don't get anything unless you do ask for them and you demand them. And you demand them aggressively rather than, calling your council person or doing those kinds of more less effective gestures. So I think kind of having this mentality of solidarity is really helpful.
Absolutely. And on that note, we have about 5 minutes left. So I did want to open the floor to the panelists if you have any questions for each other, comments on your papers, or if you want to build on any of the points that have been brought up so far.
Could I just mention one thing? We don't have to discuss it at length, but there was a comment in the Q&A about how hiring committees might evaluate patchwork. And it might not be exactly the answer that the questioner had in mind, but I was just thinking, as somebody who trained always as an anthropologist, but has now worked for quite a while in a very interdisciplinary space, that I think as patchwork ethnographers, on the one hand, we're trying to reject a policing of ethnography that is unhelpful within the discipline. But on the other hand, when we're in interdisciplinary spaces, we're often deeply championing the things that we want to retain from ethnography. So it puts us in a kind of a double bind. Sometimes we get the best of both worlds if we're in an ethnography in an interdisciplinary space, but sometimes it's very uncomfortable on both sides of that challenge. So for hiring committees, I think it's only anthropologists who really, or it's most of all anthropologists who really struggle with the patchworkness. There are actually many other interdisciplinary spaces which may have other questions about our work, but not about the patchwork. Sorry, I didn't mean to kill the conversation.
Oh, it's great. Yeah, again, opening the floor, any of the panelists, if you have questions you'd like to ask each other, comments on papers, or if you saw a question in the Q&A you wanted to respond to.
I did, there was a question earlier and I didn't answer it, but I wanted to think about it, just like how, what I would do differently. And just hearing the previous sort of comment, I did this with my this project with my ethnographic research methods course, and it's ongoing. And so those students, some of them are continuing, and then I'm going to teach it again in the fall, and there will be more students who are doing it who elected to participate. But I found that shift from gender, women, sexuality studies to anthropology is that the students are very hypermobile that are already in anthropology courses compared to the courses I've taught in gender, women, sexuality studies. And really, I think for this to work, and I am a champion of ethnography, I think it's really important. I do think that there have to be more people in the fold and more diverse body minds to even think about how to do this. And most of the people who are in sort of critical disability studies spaces tend towards doing more stuff in the humanities, not ethnographic research. And so I was thinking if there's a way to sort of build this in as a critical disability studies course, because there's always more to learn. And I think whoever's at the table really shapes what the conversations are. And since people will self-select in anthropology because they feel like they have the capacity and interest, but also because some people are actively discouraged from being anthropologists, I think sort of bringing it outside of anthropology spaces would be really important for this project.
Of you for this fantastic panel. We are going to go into a 15-minute break now. So to our attendees, feel free to mute us, to get up and move around, maybe get a glass of water, and we will be back at, let's see, I'm on Pacific time, so I'm trying to do the translations in my head, but it will be 9:30 a.m. Pacific, 12:30 p.m. Eastern time, and 5:30 p.m. in the UK. We will come back together for our next panel. Please don't leave. You can just come back when it's time.